London in the February of that year was a city full of music, and none of it belonged to the people who made it. It came out of the lit windows of every good square and went up into the wet dark and was gone. A pianoforte in one house, 4 fiddles and a flute in the next. The season had begun, and the season ran on sound the way a mill runs on water, and nobody in any of those bright rooms had ever once wondered where the sound came from. That was the first thing you learned if you made it for a living. You were not company, and you were not a guest. You were a service, like the coal and the candles and the wine. You came on foot in the rain, with your hands wrapped in flannel, because cold hands are slow hands, and a slow hand does not get asked twice. You went in at the back. You played behind a screen, and a footman paid you in the passage, and the room you had filled for 4 hours never once saw your face, and a great house could tell in 8 bars whether a player was worth the money. Most of them could not have told a psalm from a jig. But they had their judgment all the same, and it came down in 8 bars, and it never came back up again. They had made their judgment about the young woman going from house to house that winter. It had not taken them 8 bars. It had not taken them 1. They had not needed to hear her play. The trouble was not her hands. Her hands were as fine as any in England, and 1 or 2 men who genuinely knew what they were listening to had said so, quietly, where it could do them no harm to be overheard. The trouble was her name. She had learned to keep it back until the very end, until the terms were agreed, and everybody pleased, because she had learned what the name did. The moment she gave it, the listening stopped. Eloan Caro was 26 years old. She had been a great musician's daughter once, and she was nothing at all now. And she had done it to herself. That was the part nobody ever guessed. She had chosen this. She stood that afternoon in the music room of the last house on her list and waited while the lady of it made up her mind. The harp was the house's own, a piece of furniture that happened to have strings, bought because a harp in a drawing room says a thing about a family that the family cannot say for itself. It had not been touched in a year. She had known that within 4 bars, and she had made her allowances and played it anyway, and played it well, because you do not give a room less than the whole of your work, simply because the room does not deserve it. That is not for the room. That is for you, Mrs. Matta. Lorimer had come in halfway through and stayed to the end, and when it finished she said, "Oh, but that is quite lovely," in the surprised voice of a woman who had braced herself to endure something and found she did not have to. She talked terms. She asked whether the harpist would object to sitting behind the screen, which the harpist would not, having sat behind a great many screens. Then she went to the little table for her pencil, to write the engagement down, and asked, pleasantly, for the name. Eloan gave it. It was a small thing, the change in a face. A stillness first, while the name went in and found what it was looking for. Then the drawing back, the tightening about the mouth, the look of a woman who has picked up a cup and found the rim of it chipped and is deciding, without any hurry at all, how to set it down. "Caro!" said Mrs. Lorimer.
"Yes,"
said Eloan. The pencil did not move. "I am afraid I have been very stupid," said Mrs. Lorimer. "The evening is engaged already. My sister arranged it and did not think to tell me." "You will understand." Eloan said that she understood. She was given her music back at the door, and with it the advice, because there was always advice. "I say this kindly," said Mrs. Lorimer, "and I do mean it kindly. There is no house in London that will take that name in at the door, and there will not be, not in your lifetime. Go north, to the manufacturing towns, where they read the papers less and forget them sooner. And for pity's sake, call yourself something else. Nobody living would blame you for it." The door shut behind her, a good door, painted glossy black, and she went down the steps into the wet square, and behind her, through the tall, cold window of the room she had just been turned out of, somebody began to play the pianoforte, badly and with enormous confidence, and to a great deal of laughter. She stood on the pavement in the rain and listened, because she had never once in her life been able to help listening, and she understood then, finally, and all the way down, that there was more music in one square of that city than a person could hear in a lifetime, and that not one bar of it, from the parks to the river, was ever going to be played by her. And she could have stopped it at any moment. The whole of her ruin was one word long, and she had chosen the word herself. Her father was Ambrose Caro. He had come up out of a cathedral choir school with nothing but an ear, and by the time he was 50, he was the man that other musicians went to when they wanted to know whether a thing was any good. He was never fashionable. He had not the smallest gift for it, and had never troubled to acquire one. He wrote, and he conducted, and he taught, and in the last good years of his life he wrote a symphony. The world calls it the Vesper Symphony. The world has called it that for 12 years. It is played in every capital in Europe, and every printed score of it in existence carries the name of Sir Leopold Stern. Sir Leopold was a gentleman of large fortune and a real love of music, and no gift for it whatsoever, which is a combination that has destroyed more men than drink. He had been Caro's patron for 11 years. He paid for the copying of the parts. He kept the manuscript in his own house for safety, as he kept a great many things. When the symphony was played, it was played under his name. And Caro said, in the quiet way of a man who cannot conceive of not being believed, that the work was his own. Sir Leopold Stern wept. That was what the newspapers made most of afterward. He did not shout, and he did not threaten. He wept, in front of witnesses, at the ingratitude of it. And then he produced a manuscript in Ambrose Caro's own hand, a full and beautiful fair copy of the symphony, marked at the head, in Caro's own writing, as a copy made for a pupil, and dated and signed. It was a forgery, and a very good one. Caro had made 3 fair copies of that symphony with his own hand, because he trusted no other hand with it, and any one of them could be worked upon by a man who had all 3 in his house and a 12-month to think. But it was his hand. 3 men swore to the hand in a courtroom, and one was a man Caro had taught for nothing when the boy could not pay. There was nobody to swear for him who counted for anything. A knight of fortune on the one side, and on the other a hired musician with ink on his cuffs. They did not even call him a thief. They called him something worse. They called him a copyist, a drudge with a fine hand and no gift, who had spent his life writing out other men's music, and had at last in his old age tried to take a gentleman's genius for his own. He was finished inside a month. He died the following year in a rented room in Southwark of nothing the physicians could name, which is to say of shame, and his daughter was 15 and was holding his hand when he went. He told her near the end that he had never in his life taken a bar of music that was not his own. She believed him. Her belief weighed nothing anywhere. It was not evidence. It was not even news. She was sent up to Norfolk to her mother's sister, and there she stayed 9 years, in a flint town on the edge of the marshes where nobody had heard of anybody. Her aunt gave her a bed and a name, and the name was Marsh, which had been her mother's, and Elowen Marsh taught the pianoforte to the daughters of corn merchants, and was respectable and safe, and quite unremarkable, and nobody in that town ever knew that they had a great man's daughter living over the saddler's shop. Her aunt died 2 years ago and left her £40 and the harp, and Elowen Marsh went down to London and stood in a shipping office off the Strand, and was handed a form to fill out with her name upon it. She sat with the pen in her hand for a long time. She could have written Marsh. It was hers. It was legally hers, and there was not a court in England that could have called it a lie. She could have taught the pianoforte in London for the rest of her life, and been safe, and been warm, and been nobody. She wrote Caro. She was never able afterward to explain it, and never once tried. She only knew that a man had died in a rented room, believing the world had settled its opinion of him forever, and that she was the last piece of him left above ground, and that if she went about the earth under another name, then the world would have been right, and he would be a thief in his grave with nobody in it to say otherwise. So she gave her name, and the doors began to close, and they had been closing for 2 years. She kept the harp. She kept it because it was his, and because it was the one thing she owned that could earn, and because a harp is not a thing a woman carries down a staircase by herself in any case. It stood in the room in Southwark, and she slept beside it, and on the mornings when her hands were too cold to work, she sat with them pushed up under her arms until they came back to her. She was 3 weeks behind with the rent that February. She had 2 shillings, and it was her own doing, and she would have done it again. She was still standing in the wet square outside Mrs. Lorimer's door when the carriage came. She had not heard it, which was strange, because she heard everything, always. She could not sit in a room without knowing which of the clocks in it ran slow, but she had not heard it come, and she looked up, and it was simply there at the curb, dark and very plain and very good, with nothing painted on the panel to tell you anything at all. A footman got down. He crossed the wet stones with a careful blankness like a man who has been told to be certain and not to be curious, and asked whether he had the honor of speaking to Miss Carrow. She said that he had. He gave her a letter, 1 sheet, folded once, sealed with plain wax, her name on the outside in a spare upright hand she had never seen. She opened it there, in the rain, with fingers gone clumsy, and read it, and then read it again, because the first time it did not go in. There were 4 lines. You are engaged to play at Aldenmere House on Thursday evening. The fee is 20 guineas. You will be asked for 1 waltz alone in the interval, and for nothing else. The carriage will come for you at 8. There was no signature. At the foot of the sheet, where a man writes his name, somebody had drawn 5 notes on a scrap of a staff. She looked at them a long while. They were set down the way a musician sets things down, small and quick and without fuss, by a hand that had done it 10,000 times, and they meant nothing to her whatever. 5 notes, a thing too short to be a phrase. She turned the paper over. There was nothing on the back. 20 guineas was more than she had earned in the whole of that winter. It was the rent and the coal and the physician she had not gone to, and it was not a fee for a waltz. Nobody in England paid 20 guineas for a waltz. You could have the best hands in London for 2, and she had been told so, in those exact words, by people who thought they were telling her what she was worth. "Whose carriage is this?" she said. "His Grace's, miss." "His Grace of what?" "Wexmore, miss." And Aloan Carrow, who had believed there was nothing left in the world with the power to frighten her, felt the cold go down 1 degree further. Because she knew that name. There was nobody in England who did not. "Why," she said, aloud to the footman, to the letter to nobody at all. "Why should he send for me? He has never in his life heard me play." She heard herself say that she would come. She asked about him in the 2 days that followed, and she did not have to ask hard. There is nothing cheaper in London than the truth about a man nobody knows. The Duke of Wexmore did not speak. That was the whole of it, and everybody had it. And no 2 of the reasons agreed. Some said he was mad, in the quiet, expensive way that runs in old families and gets shut up behind a good name. Some said he had done something in his youth that a man does not come back from, and had never trusted his own tongue since, for fear of what it might let out of him. Some said he simply held the rest of the world too cheap to answer it. Of all the injuries a man can do to society, the one it forgives least is to be found not worth talking to. What none of them disputed was the fact. He sat at the head of long tables and contributed nothing. He went down to the House and voted, and never rose. He was not dumb, for his servants were spoken to, and his lawyers, and his grandmother, but he had not been heard to put a dozen words together in a public room in 11 years, and there were girls out that season who had been in the nursery when he stopped, and who had grown up thinking of the Duke of Wexmore as a kind of weather. That was the part everybody had. It was the other part that made Aloan sit down slowly on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hand. He had been a prodigy. Not a gentleman amateur with a pretty touch, but the real and frightening article. And she had heard the stories all her life without ever once attaching them to a title. The boy who could name every note in a struck chord of 9. The boy who halted an orchestra of 60 to observe, without any apparent unkindness, that the third desk of the second violins was a quarter tone flat, and who was right. The boy who conducted at 20 and made men who had played 30 years feel they had never properly played at all. And then, at 22, he stopped. He put it down. Not slowly and not sadly, the way a man puts down a thing he has wearied of, but all at once the way you blow out a lamp. He never conducted again. He never played again. The instruments went out of Aldenmere House, sold or given away, or simply carried down the stairs one morning and never carried back, and the great music room at the top of that house, which had been the finest private room for sound in London, stood empty with its shutters closed. And now that house had sent a carriage out into the rain to find her and offered 20 guineas, which nobody paid, for one waltz which anybody could play. It was not a name to stake your last hope on. She sat with the letter until the candle was gone, and she thought about the manufacturing towns and about the rent and about a house that had gone 11 years in silence and had broken it for a harp. Thursday came. Aldenmere House was ablaze from the pavement to the roof, every window gold, the carriages backed the length of the square, and the link boys running. She went in at the back, which she expected, and was taken up a stone stair by a girl with a candle. What she had not expected was the harp. It stood alone on a low dais at the far end of the long room, and it was a beautiful instrument, better than anything she had touched in 2 years. She put her hand to it, while the room was still filling, and found it perfectly in tune, which was ordinary enough, and found it warm, which was not. Somebody had kept it by a fire. Somebody in that house had known that a cold harp plays flat, and had troubled to see that this one was not cold, and had thought of it hours before she came. They played till midnight, and she sat behind the others, and did her work, and was not looked at. She saw the room, though it was her habit to see rooms. And she saw, among the great and the fashionable, a handsome woman of near 50, smooth-faced and gracious and entirely at her ease, at whose approach people arranged themselves. She asked the second fiddle in a whisper who that was, and he told her, and Caro looked at the widow of Sir Leopold Stern across 40 feet of candlelight and went on playing, because she was being paid to. Then supper was called, and the company went through, and the fiddles went down to the passage for their beer, and a servant came to say that the harp was wanted now alone, and that Miss was to go out onto the dais, not behind the screen. Out. In front of them she went. She sat. The room did not look back, because the room was eating, and she saw him. He was at the far end by a pillar, standing the way a man stands when he has no intention of being spoken to. Tall and dark and entirely still, with a face that gave away nothing whatever, and he was the only person in that whole bright, crowded room who was not talking to somebody. He was looking at the harp. She began the waltz. It was the simplest thing she had played in a 12-month, an old Viennese air that everybody had danced to and nobody had ever thought about for a moment, and she could have played it in her sleep, and often had. She let it go out into the noise of the room, and the noise took it and swallowed it, and she thought, without bitterness, because bitterness cost too much, that she was the most expensive wallpaper in England. And then, in the second turn, her hand betrayed her. It was the fourth finger of the left hand. It had been stiffening all winter, and she had told herself it was nothing, and now, on a good instrument, in the easiest music in the world, it simply did not come down when she called it. She lost the note, she lost the bar. And her hands, without her, went somewhere else. She heard it happening. That was the horror of it. She sat there and listened to her own fingers walk out of the waltz and into 3 bars of something else entirely, something slow and small and strange, in the wrong key and the wrong time and the wrong century, and she could no more have stopped them than she could have stopped her heart. It was a thing her father used to play. It had no name. He had made it for her when she was 9 years old and taught it to her by ear, the way he taught her everything, and she had played it 10,000 times in the dark of 100 rooms, and it had never once occurred to her to wonder what it was. 3 bars. 4 seconds, perhaps. Then she got hold of herself and brought it round and slid back into the waltz on the beat, as though nothing had happened, and she finished the piece and stood up and made her curtsy. They applauded. It was the applause of people with their mouths full, and it stopped very nearly before it began. Nobody had noticed. She looked out over the whole shining length of that room and saw it perfectly plainly. Not one soul in that house had heard her hands come apart. They had not heard the waltz either. They would not have heard it if she had played it backward, and she had done it anyway. That was what sat in her chest, like a swallowed stone, as she came down off the dais. She had broken in the middle, her father's daughter, and her father's hands, and she had come apart in 4 seconds of an air that a child could play. And it did not matter that nobody had heard, because she had heard, and she would go on hearing it for the rest of her life. She went down the back stair with her face burning. At the bottom, a footman was picking pieces of glass out of the matting. One of the gentlemen dropped his, he said when she looked at it, just at the end there, made everybody jump. She was paid in the passage, 20 guineas counted into her hand, and the carriage took her home through the wet dark to Southwark, and she told herself over and over in time with the wheels that she would never be sent for again. She was wrong about that, and about a good deal else. There had been one person in that room who heard every note she played. He had heard the 4th finger fail before it failed, the way you hear a stair give under a man before he falls through it. He had heard the waltz go and heard what came in after it, and he had known it inside half a bar. He had known it because he had heard it once before, 11 years earlier, played very slowly and very badly on a hired pianoforte in a rented room in Southwark, by a dying man who had wanted somebody, anybody, to hear it before he went. That was the glass on the matting. That was the man at the pillar. He stood with his hand flat against the cold stone and watched her come down off the dais, ashamed, believing herself disgraced, carrying in her 2 hands the only proof left anywhere on the earth that her father had not been a thief. And 40 feet away, at the supper table, with her back to the platform and her attention on the lobster, the widow of Sir Leopold Stern had heard nothing at all. The letter came 8 days later, and by then she had given up hoping for one. It offered a post. Companion and musician to the Dowager Duchess of Wexmoor at Ilvern in Somerset. £80 the year and her keep. The carriage would come on Tuesday. It was written in the same spare, upright hand, and at the foot of it, where a name should go, there was nothing at all this time. No letter, no notes, only a small, clean space. As though the writer had lifted the pen and thought better of the whole business, she braced herself on the road for what she was going into. A silent man, she reasoned, would keep a silent house. Shut and cold and dark, covered furniture and long corridors and clocks that nobody wound. Ilvern was not that. It was a long, low old house of grey Somerset stone that had grown out of its hill over 400 years without anybody ever having a plan for it. And in the blue February dusk it was lit from end to end, the smoke going up straight from a dozen chimneys into the still cold air, and it looked, she thought, getting down stiff and frightened in the courtyard, like a house that was lived in and loved. She was taken in by the housekeeper, a small, round, anxious woman named Mrs. Quilliam, who took her cold hands into both her own, as though hands were a thing of value, and led her up, and stopped at the door of the music room, and opened it, and stood back to let her go in first. There was a fire in it, burning as though it had been lit hours before and tended since, and in the light of it, standing quietly on its own feet as though it had been there always, was her father's harp. Owen Caro stood in the doorway and could not move. She had left it in Southwark under a sheet in a cold room, because a harp is not a thing a woman carries about with her, and she had made her peace with never seeing it again, and had made that peace so carefully that she had not permitted herself to think of it once on the road. It was here, it was cleaned. The pillar had been polished, and the crack in the soundboard that she had lived with for 2 years had been stopped and mended by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. And it was strung. She crossed the room and put her hand on it before she knew she had moved, and she drew it, and it was in tune. It was in tune to a pitch she had not heard in 11 years, because it was the pitch her father had kept it at all his life, which was not the pitch anybody else in England used. Nobody had asked her. It had simply been done, days ago, before ever she agreed to come, by somebody who had known which harp, and which room, and which fire, and which pitch. Who did this, she said. Mrs. Quilliam twitched the curtain straight, and something crossed the kind, anxious face, some private wondering of her own. His Grace had it fetched. Miss, she said, he came up himself to see the room warmed. He does not often come to this floor. I could not tell you why he took the trouble. He does not tell anybody why he takes any trouble, but he took it. And Elowen stood in front of the fire in the light of her father's harp, and could not make sense of any of it. In 2 years, nobody had lit a fire for her before she asked. She had forgotten there were places where such a thing was simply done. She met the Dowager that evening, and the Dowager at least was comprehensible. Lady Hesper was near 80, a small, upright woman with a hard, bright face, and a stick she did not need and used anyway. She talked from the moment Elowen came into the room, a dry, running commentary on the house and the county and the weather and the failings of everybody in all three, and it took Elowen some time to understand that the talk was a kindness. The old woman had seen her fright and was covering it. It took her rather longer to understand the other thing. Lady Hesper was going deaf. She said so herself quite calmly, in the middle of something else. I am losing my hearing. It has been going 4 years. The physicians give me 2 more, and I have stopped paying them for the privilege of being told. I am not asking for pity, and I shall be extremely rude to you if you offer me any. She set down her cup. I have loved music the whole of my life. It is the only thing I ever loved that did not once disappoint me. And it is going to be taken away, and there is nobody on this earth who can prevent it. And so I have decided to spend what is left of it greedily. That is what you are for. You are not here to fetch my shawl. You are here to play to me every day that I have, and when I cannot hear you any longer, you will go on playing, because I shall still be able to feel it come up through the floor. Elowen said, when she could, that she would. Then Lady Hesper looked at her a long moment with her hard, bright eyes and said, Caro. Yes, said Elowen. She had learned to stop before the name. She did not stop now. You knew it when you sent for me. I knew it, said Lady Hesper, when he sent for you. But she said one thing more at the door. When Elowen was going up, you will want to ask me about my grandson. You will want to ask me a great many things, and you will be quite right to want it. And I tell you now that I have given him my word, and I shall keep it, which will be the hardest thing I have done in some years. Ask him instead. You will get no answer. Ask him anyway. And Miss Caro, when you play in this house, play everything. Play whatever comes into your hands, whether it belongs there or not. I am told that in this house that is how a person is understood. She could not sleep in a strange bed, and so she went down. It was not yet light. The house had that particular grade of quiet that a very old house gets in the last hour before dawn, when the fires are down to ash, and the servants are not yet up, and the whole building seems to be holding its breath. She came along the passage in her shawl with a candle, and sat down to her father's harp in the dark, and put her hands on it. The Duke of Wexmoor was standing in the doorway. He was tall and dark, with hair going gray too early at the temples, and a hard, still face that gave nothing away. and he stood with one hand on the frame and listened to her the way a hungry man looks at bread. She had braced herself, the whole long road from London, for what a man like that might want from a woman he had taken into his house. She met his eyes across the room and knew at once that she had braced for entirely the wrong thing. That there was nothing in them of what she had feared. There was something else. It was the look of a man hearing a thing he had given up for lost. He inclined his head. He did not speak. He looked at her a moment longer with that whole terrible attention, and then he turned and went away down the passage, and she heard nothing of his going whatever. She came down the next morning, because she could not help it, and he came again. He came in and sat at the far end of the room, in the manner of a man taking a chair he has already decided is his, by right, and folded his hands and listened. He did not once look at her while she played. He looked at the floor, or at nothing, in the way of a person listening so hard that seeing has become an interruption. On the third morning, she did a thing she could never afterward explain. She was playing an old air, a slow one, and she came to the end of a phrase, and instead of resolving it, she stopped. She let it hang there unfinished, wanting its last two notes, and she took her hands off the strings and folded them in her lap and sat perfectly still and waited. Behind her, she heard him get up. She did not turn. She heard him cross the room, not toward the door, but away toward the corner where an old square instrument stood under a dust cloth, a thing she had taken for a table. She heard the cloth come off. She heard the lid go up, and the small, dry complaint of hinges that have not moved in a long time. And then, in a thin, sweet, cracked voice, very quietly, an old spinet played two notes. They were the two notes. They finished her phrase. They finished it exactly in the only way it could honestly be finished, and they were a little flat, because the instrument had not been tuned since before she was grown, and he did not appear to mind that in the least. Then the lid came down, and he went out, and Deloan Caro sat in front of her father's harp with her heart going like a bird in a box. "That spinet," said Mrs. Porce. Quilliam later, standing in the doorway with a duster in her hand and her mouth open, was his mother's. "It has not been lifted, miss, in 11 years. Not by him. Not by anybody. I have dusted that cloth every week of my life, and I have never once seen it moved." They talked every morning after that at the gray hour, and not one word of it was ever spoken by him aloud. She would say a thing out loud, ordinarily, the way one does, some remark about the piece under her hands, or a piece of nonsense she had read, and he would sit and listen, and then after a while he would go to the spinet and lift the lid and answer her. She said on a wet morning that the composer of the thing she was playing had plainly never been in love, and had got the whole business out of a book. XX Moore played her a small, pompous, rising figure that puffed itself up and got nowhere, and sat down again, and it was so exactly a portrait of the man in his book that she put her head down on the frame of the harp and laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. She said another day that she supposed he thought her playing sentimental. He played 4 notes, which conveyed, quite unmistakably, that he did. She said stung. That at least she played. There was a very long silence from the corner. Then the lid came down without a note in it, and he went out, and she sat in the empty room with her face burning and despised herself thoroughly for an hour. The next morning there was a phrase waiting for her. He was not in the room. He had been in it and gone, and left the spinet standing open with a sheet of paper propped against the music rest, and on the paper, in that quick musician's hand, 3 bars. She played them back to him the following morning, and she played them better than he had written them, and she saw the corner of that hard mouth move. It was not a smile. It was the place a smile starts from. She thought about it for the rest of the day. She began to write them down. That was not planned. She simply found herself one night sitting up in bed with a candle and a little marbled notebook she had bought for accounts, setting down from memory the phrases he had played her that week and dating them, and after that she did it every night without once failing and never asked herself why. She played, on a morning in March, without thinking, the little nameless piece of her father's, the one her hands had run to when the fourth finger failed. She was not thinking of the ball. She had put the ball away from her as one puts away a shame. She was only warming her hands, and it was the thing her hands went to, as it had always been. She had not got through 4 bars when she heard the chair go back. He was on his feet, and already at the door. He went out without a sound and without a look, and she sat there with the phrase dying under her fingers and no notion on earth what she had done. Let us take a very short break here. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He was not idle. That surprised her most of all, for she had pictured a silent duke as a man who sat and brooded at his own reflection. Cashin of Wexmoor worked quietly and continually at the running of a great estate and a great deal else besides, and he did nearly all of it on paper, from a study whose door stood open and whose silence was never empty. Letters went out from Ilvern by the dozen, and money went with them, and Elowen, who had the run of the house, began to see in pieces where the money went. She found the first of it in April, and it very nearly stopped her heart. She had asked Mrs. Quilliam, idly, over the mending, how the harp had been got out of Southwark, for she could not conceive how anybody at Ilvern had even known where to look for it. And Mrs. Quilliam, who was not a discreet woman and had never claimed to be, said comfortably that His Grace had had the direction these 2 years past from Mr. Ray. Mr. Ray was the tuner. He was a bent little man with a bad chest who had come to the room in Southwark every quarter day for 2 years, without fail in all weathers, and had tuned her father's harp and mended whatever wanted mending, and had refused every single time to take a penny for it. She had begged him to. And old Ray had shaken his head and coughed and said, always in the same words, that he had known Ambrose Carow, and that he did not take money from Ambrose Carow's daughter, and that she was to say no more about it. He had been paid, of course, every quarter day for 2 years, by a man in Somerset she had never met, who had never once permitted his name to be spoken in that room, and who had understood that a woman with nothing left would sooner starve than take charity, and who had therefore gone to the expense of arranging for her not to know that she was taking it. There was a boy in the village, young Ansel, the son of a woman who took in washing, who had an ear of the sort that turns up in a parish once in 50 years. He was at the cathedral choir school now, boarded and clothed and taught. His fees paid out of what the village called the society, and nobody could tell you the name of a single member of it, nor where its rooms were, nor who had founded it. His mother spoke of it at her gate with tears standing in her eyes, and said she prayed for the society every night of her life. Elowen said that she was sure the society heard her. And there was Ephraim Salas. He lived in a cottage at the edge of the park, an old man with a hand that had gone under a cart-wheel in a bad winter, and Elowen walked out to him with a basket from Lady Hesper and stayed 3 hours, because he had been a violinist, and once you have found another musician you do not leave in a hurry. He talked about the hand without any bitterness at all. Then he talked about the pension that came to him from a benevolent fund for orchestral men, which was a very fine thing, he said, and which he had never once heard of in 40 years of playing, and neither had any other man he had ever asked. I know, miss, I am old. I am not simple. There is no fund. There is a man. He comes up this lane at first light 3 or 4 times in the year, and he stands at my gate and looks at my roof to see is it sound, and he is gone again before I have got my boots on. He has never come in. He has never spoken one word to me in 11 years, and I have never been able to thank him, which is the entire reason he does it that way. I say a prayer for him with no name in it, he said. I dare say it gets where it is going. She asked Lady Hesper about it once. So he gives what cannot be laughed at. A roof cannot be laughed at. A pension cannot be laughed at. A string tuned true is true whether or not a single person in the room believes in it. He has spent 11 years doing good in the only language he still trusts, which is the language of things that are simply so, and he has done more of it in his silence than this county has managed in all its talking. Something broke the habit in him. I was there when it broke. I have watched him pay for it every day of 11 years, and I would give what is left of my own life to undo it, and I cannot, because the only person living who could undo it is himself, and he will not, because he no longer believes there is any point in the attempt. There was a dinner at Ilvern at the end of April, a small, dull county dinner of the sort that Lady Hesper gave 4 times a year out of duty and complained about for a fortnight beforehand. Mrs. Vellicott came to it. Mrs. Vellicott came to it. Vellicott came to everything. She was a comfortable woman with a comfortable husband and an inexhaustible appetite for other people's afflictions, and she worked her way through the fish and the fowl and arrived over the sweets at the subject she had come for. Of course, she said, one does hear such things. They do say his grace is not quite, and she tapped her own temple with one finger and smiled round the table. My husband says that a man who will not speak is a man with something he dare not say. Eloan set down her glass. She had not meant to speak. She heard herself speak. Your husband is mistaken, she said. The whole table turned. I have lived under this roof 2 months, said Eloan Caro, in a voice that was perfectly level and that she did not recognize as her own. In that time, I have seen a boy with an ear worth more than this county's entire income sent to a choir school by a fund that does not exist. I have seen an old violinist with a ruined hand kept in his cottage by a benevolent society that has no members. And I have seen an instrument mended in a city 100 miles from here every quarter day for 2 years by a tuner who was paid a great deal of money to say that he was doing it for nothing. None of it was signed. Every single piece of it was arranged so that the person saved by it could never look him in the face and thank him, because he did not want their gratitude. He wanted them fed. That is not a man with something he dare not say. That is a man who worked out a long time ago that talking is cheap and doing is dear, and who has chosen the dear one every day for 11 years, while people who have never in their lives paid for anything sit at his table and tap their temples over the sweets. Mrs. Vellicott's smile had gone quite stiff. At the head of the table, Lady Hesper made a small noise into her wine that might have been a cough and was not, and Eloan sat with her heart slamming and understood 2 things in the same instant: that she had been unforgivably rude to a guest under her employer's roof, and that she had meant every syllable of it and would say it again tomorrow. She only knew that when she came down the next morning at the gray hour, the spinet was already open, and he did not sit at the far end of the room. He brought the little stool round and set it near her, near enough that she could have touched his sleeve, and he looked at her once, and then he began to play, and when she came in on the harp beneath him, he did not stop. They played together for an hour in the growing light, an old thing that they both happened to know. He was not a great player of the spinet. His hands were 11 years out of practice, and they let him down twice. But under everything he had the most extraordinary ear that she had ever sat beside, and he heard her before she heard herself, and he was under her and around her and waiting for her at every turn as though he had been reading her mind for years. He had planned the whole of it in silence, naturally, in the way that he planned everything. Find the daughter. Get her out of that city. Keep her fed and warm and safe. Go on gathering. And when the weight of the thing was sufficient and the moment right, put the whole of it down in front of the world and give her back her father's name. He had not planned for the gray hour. He had not planned for a woman who told him to his face that his taste in composers was sentimental and turned out to be right. He had not planned for the way a house sounds when there is somebody playing in it, or for waking before the light and lying in the dark, waiting, listening for the first note to come up through the floor. She was the proof. Not her father's papers, which were gone. Not the copyist's ledgers, which could be argued with. Not the letter that had cost him 4 years and a great deal of money to get out of a man in Antwerp, which was good, and which a clever lawyer would call a forgery inside an hour, since that was exactly what had been done to Ambrose Carow in the first place. Her hands. What her hands did when her mind let go of them. He had known it inside half a bar in a supper room in London, and had gone home and sat in the dark until morning, and had understood two things by daylight: that he could clear Ambrose Carow's name at last, and that the moment he told the daughter what she was carrying, he would be setting her down in front of the one person in England who could not afford for it to be true. It was Lady Hesper who told her, in the end, and she did it in May, on a hard, bright morning, in the way that very old people do a great many things, which is to say, without preamble and without apology. You still do not know why you are in this house. It is eating you. I have watched it eat you since Lady Day. I am going to break my word to my grandson, and I am not going to pretend to be sorry, because I am nearly 80, and I have earned the right to break a word or two before I go. Do you know how your father was ruined, child? The whole of it, or only the part they printed? I know that he did not do it, said Aloan. No, said Lady Hesper, he did not. And there was one man in England who could prove it, and he was 22 years old, and he had conducted that symphony for 6 weeks from your father's own working score, and he knew whose mind had been in it. He stood up and said so, in front of every person who could have stopped the thing, and they laughed at him. A boy with a title and no sense, and no proof but his own certainty. And then they took his speaking, and they sharpened it, and handed it to your father's enemies, and they said, there now, the man has not a friend left in England, but a duke's boy, who will say anything to anybody. His speaking did not lift a single stone off your father. It piled on another. That is what Cassian has carried for 11 years. Not that he failed him, that he made it worse. And then he gave up music. I do not see why, said Aloan. Because his ear was how he knew, said Lady Hesper. Do you not see it? It was his ear that told him the truth. It was his ear that heard a working score and knew whose mind had been in it. And his ear was right, and being right was worth nothing. And being right had helped to finish a man. What is the use of an ear like that in a world that will not hear it? He put it down. He put all of it down, until you came into my house and stopped in the middle of a phrase and would not finish it, and he could not endure it, and he got out of his chair after 11 years and opened his mother's spinet to finish it for you. I have prayed for somebody to make him do that for 11 years, and it was done by a girl who left out 2 notes. And he has watched all this while for what became of the daughter. He could not give your father his name back while your father lived, and your father is 11 years in the ground, but the daughter was somewhere in the world, paying for a crime that was not even her own. When your name came up out of the ground 2 years ago and the doors of London started shutting, he did the one thing a man can do without opening his mouth. He sent a carriage. Loan Carow sat very still for a long while in that bright, cold room, and she understood, with a pain that took the breath clean out of her, that every single thing he had done for her had not been done for her at all. It had been done for a debt to a dead man, out of a guilt 11 years old, by a man who had never expected or wanted or so much as imagined that the daughter might come to matter to him in her own right. She had fallen in love with the Duke of Wexmoor. He did not know it. He would never guess it. He believed himself to be squaring an account. And it is a bitter thing for a proud woman to be treated tenderly out of guilt for her father, and pride was the only property she had left. It was not weakness, and it was not even love, though love was in it. She had sat in the gray light of 100 mornings and had come to see the man who lived behind the debt, and the man behind the debt was worth more than the debt, and worth more, heaven forgive her, than her pride. She could not walk out of a house where a man had shut himself in silence for 11 years over a wound nobody had ever tried to reach, when she was very possibly the only living person who could reach it. The man who ruined her father was dead, but he had left a widow, and the widow was very much alive, and the widow was Lady Ottoline Stern. She had built her whole life since her husband's death upon three things: his name, his fortune, and the great warm reputation he had left behind him, the charitable knight who had given England its symphony. She kept all three the way a sentry keeps a bridge, because they were the whole of what she had, and a great deal of the money that clothed her and dowered her daughters came out of the printed scores of the Vesper Symphony, which carried her husband's name upon the title page. It made no difference either way. She knew that the name of Caro living under the roof of the Duke of Wexmoor was a danger of a wholly different order, because Wexmoor was the one man in England who had ever stood up in a lit room and spoken that name in the same breath as her husband's. She did not attack the girl's playing. Nobody in England could have attacked the girl's playing. She attacked the girl's character, which is the oldest weapon there is, and the cruel economy of it was that it cost her nothing at all. A young woman, unmarried, living in the house of an unmarried duke, that was the whole of the material. It needed no invention and no lie. It needed only to be mentioned in the right voice, in the right drawing rooms, and the mention would do the rest of the work by itself. It did not matter that Lady Hesper lived at Ilvern, or that the girl was a paid musician and nothing else. Lady Ottoline mentioned it. She mentioned it graciously, with a little sigh, with a great show of reluctance. In a dozen drawing rooms in 6 weeks. What a pity it was. That whatever one thought of the father, and one hardly cared to think of the father, the daughter should have thrown away the last rag she had left, and gone to live so very irregularly with a man like Wexmoor, of whom one heard such things. Inside a month it was everywhere. It was no longer a duke's charity to a ruined man's daughter. It was a scandal, an open one, and it clung to a Lowen exactly as the first disgrace had clung, and it did precisely what it had been built to do. It made her presence at Ilvern a thing that would destroy in the end, not only her, but the old woman she served and the man who had taken her in. The County Music Society gave a concert every year, and for 30 years its last rehearsal had been held at Ilvern, because Lady Hesper had always given it, and had for 30 years been the society's chief, and very nearly its only support. That year she had asked them for something. It was the first thing she had ever asked of them in her life. She had asked that they come and play at Ilvern one evening in the summer, in her own hall, for her, while she could still hear them. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was extremely polite. It regretted very much. It found that the members were unable, this year, on account of prior engagements, and of certain difficulties which the writer would not be so indelicate as to name, and it trusted that her ladyship would understand. Lady Hesper read it twice, standing at the window with her back to the room. Then she folded it into 4 and put it in the fire and said, in a voice that shook with a rage Lowen had never heard from her before, "So, they will not play for me at 80 on account of a lie about a girl. They have taken my money for 30 years, and they will not play for me once." Lowen stood alone in the music room with her father's harp beside her and understood, with a sickness she could taste, exactly what her staying had cost. She went to him that evening. She stood in the doorway and made herself say it, plainly, because he was a man who valued the things that were simply so, and a plain truth plainly said was the only real thing she had left to give him. "You must let me go," she said. "You know what is being said. You know who is saying it. Your grandmother has been refused the only thing she has ever asked anybody for, at 80, by people she has kept out of her own purse for 30 years, and it is because I am under your roof. That woman means to ruin all 3 of us, and she will manage it, because there is no answer to be made to a thing that is never quite said. And I know why I am here. Lady Hesper told me, and I am glad she did. I know what you did when you were 22, and I know what it cost you. I know that this was never a post and never a kindness. It was a debt. You have paid it many times over. Whatever you owed my father is discharged, and you owe me nothing at all. Let me go, and let the talk go out of this house with me, and give your grandmother back her concert, and take your own peace. It is the last thing left in the world that I can do for any of you, and I am asking you to let me do it." He stood up. He came round the desk. He stood in front of her, close, so that she had to lift her face to his, and she saw in his eyes the whole of the wound that Lady Hesper had named, and something else besides, something that had not been there on that first gray morning, something that had been growing in a room at the top of the stairs all spring, and that had nothing whatever to do with any debt to any dead man. And the Duke of Wexmoor, who had not put a dozen words together in a public room in 11 years, opened his mouth and spoke. "No," he said. It was one word. His voice came out low and rough and cracked from disuse, and it cost him, and it was the most extraordinary sound Eloan Caro had ever heard in her life. "No," he said again, and the second one came steadier. A man relearning a thing. "You are not going anywhere. I let you believe this was a debt because it was easier. A debt is a thing I know how to pay in silence. I have paid everything in silence for 11 years. It was a debt once. It stopped being a debt a long time ago. The third morning," he said, "when you stopped in the middle of a phrase and would not finish it, and made me get out of my chair after 11 years to finish it for you. It stopped being a debt then, and I did not tell you, because I had stopped believing that anything I said could make a thing true, or safe, or worth the risk of saying it. I let you go on thinking it a debt. That was cowardice, and I have done with it. Ottoline Stern is not going to ruin you. I will not permit it, and I am not going to prevent it. In the one way I have refused to attempt for 11 years, because you have taught me this year that there is something worse than speaking a truth and having it do harm. It is holding on to a truth that would do good out of fear and calling the fear judgment. And there is a thing I must tell you now. I have been a coward about this as well, and I shall say it badly because I am 11 years out of practice, and there is no good way. You are the proof," he said. "The little piece," he said, "the nameless one. The one you played at Aldenmere when your finger failed. The one you played in this house in March, when I got up and walked out of the room, and you have thought ever since that you had offended me. You did not offend me. I could not stay in the room. Play it now. Play it, and then play the slow movement of the Vesper Symphony, the one the whole of Europe weeps over and calls the Stern Adagio, and listen with your own ears to what your own hands are doing. It is the same music. Your father made that little piece for a child of 9. He made it out of nothing, for nothing, to teach a small girl how to shape a phrase. And 5 years afterward he took it up again, and he grew it, and out of it he built the greatest slow movement written in England in 100 years, and Leopold Stern put his name on the front of it and wept in public over the ingratitude of the man who wrote it. Stern could not have known. He never heard the little piece. It was never written down and never published, and never played to anybody but you. And it exists today in exactly one place on the earth, which is your 2 hands, and it has lived there since you were 9 years old, and there is not a lawyer or a forger or a widow in England who can do anything about that at all. Paper can be got at. Your father found that out, and so did I. I have spent 11 years buying paper, and every sheet of it can be called a lie by a clever man in an afternoon. But a room can hear. He stepped back from her. I have been waiting 11 years for one thing that could not be forged. It never once occurred to me that it would turn out to be a person. And when I found out that it was, I was afraid to tell you because, from the moment you know it, you are standing in front of that woman holding the only thing on earth that can destroy her. So I said nothing, and told myself I was protecting you, and I was protecting myself, and I am ashamed of it. Go up, Eloan, sleep, if you can, and do not speak to me again about leaving. She could not speak at all. She who had done every scrap of the speaking in that house all year stood in the door of his study and could not find one word. Go up. I have letters to write tonight, and for the first time in 11 years, I know exactly what I mean to say in them. The County Music Society gave its concert that summer, as it gave it every summer in the long assembly rooms of the county town, and everybody came to it who was anybody for 30 miles. They came that year burning with the story of the Caro Girl and the Silent Duke. And they came for the great event of the evening, which had been advertised for 3 months and was the pride of the season, because it was 12 years to the month since the first English performance of the Vesper Symphony, and the society was to play the slow movement of it in honor of the occasion. And the widow of the composer had graciously consented to be present. Lady Adeline Stern came to it at the summit of her power, certain that she had won, and she had every reason to be. The girl was disgraced twice over. The old woman had been shut out of her own society, and everybody knew what the Duke of Wexmore would do, because it was the one fixed and reliable thing in that county. He would stand at the edge of the room and say nothing whatever, and the tide would carry the girl out. And so she came, on Lady Hesper's arm, into the long bright rooms full of the people who had shut their doors, and she held her back straight, and she was cut. She was cut thoroughly and immediately by 100 people at once, the shoulders turning, the small, clear ring of floor, opening around her the way it opens around a thing that might be catching. She bore it. She had borne it before. Beside her, Lady Hesper bore it too, fierce and upright in 80, and the two of them stood in their little ring of empty boards, while the whole assembly glittered and flowed around them. And across the room, Lady Adeline Stern smiled her pleasant smile. Then the society played the Stern Adagio. They played it well. It is very nearly impossible to play it badly. It went up into that long room and did what it has done in every room it has ever been played in, which is to stop the talking, and the applause came on like weather, and everybody turned to where the widow sat and applauded her as well, and she inclined her head and was content. And the Duke of Wexmore crossed the room. They did not at first understand what they were looking at. Most of them had half forgotten he was in the building, for he had been standing at the edge, as he always stood. They saw him move, and they made way for him, as they always made way, and they supposed that he was leaving. He came to where Eloan stood. He took his place beside her deliberately, inside the little ring of empty floor, so that the ring now contained a duke, and the keeping of it suddenly cost something. Then he turned and faced the room, and did the thing that nobody in that county had seen him do in 11 years. "You will forgive me," said the Duke of Wexmore, and his voice came out rough at the start, and then steadied and carried down the long room into a quiet, of the kind that falls when a room understands that something is about to be broken, if I am clumsy at this. "I am out of the habit. You have made a great deal of my silence over the years. You have called it madness, and you have called it pride, and I have heard worse from better people than are in this room. I am going to tell you tonight what it actually was, and then what I have been doing with it." He looked once at Eloan, then out again at the room. 12 years ago, I stood in front of an orchestra of 60 men in London and conducted the first English performance of the symphony you have just heard. I rehearsed it for 6 weeks, from the composer's own working score. It was blotted and crossed through and mended and arguing with itself in the margins in 3 inks, the way a working score does and a fair copy never does, and I had it under my hands every day for 6 weeks, and I know whose mind was in it as certainly as I know my own face in a glass. His name was Ambrose Caro. The stir that went through the room was like wind coming across standing corn. He let it pass. "When it broke," said Wexmore, "I stood up in a room very like this one, and I said so. I was 22. I had no proof but my own ear and my own certainty, and I said it with the whole of my heart. And you laughed at me. Some of you in this room laughed at me. I could give the names. I am not going to give them, because it would afford me pleasure, and I did not come here tonight for pleasure. You said the old man had got at me, and then you took my speaking, and you sharpened it, and you handed it to his enemies, and you said, 'There now, look at that. The man has not a friend left in England but a duke's boy who will say anything to anybody.' I stood and watched an innocent man go down under the weight of a truth that I myself had made heavier, by saying it badly, and too young, and with nothing behind it. And I learned the lesson you taught me that night, which is that in a room like this one, the truth is worth exactly nothing until somebody has earned the right to be believed. So I stopped talking, and I spent 11 years earning it. He drew a packet of papers from his coat and held it up, and the room was entirely still. The banker's record, the copyist's ledger, which was not destroyed, although it was paid for twice over to be destroyed, and a letter, in Sir Leopold Sterne's own hand, to the man he engaged to make a false fair copy in Ambrose Caro's writing, discussing the price of the work and the aging of the ink. He set the packet down. And I tell you now that this is not why I am here, because any clever man could stand up in an hour and assure you that every sheet of it is a forgery, and you would be very glad indeed to believe him, and I should be exactly where I stood at 22. Paper can be got at. That is the entire method by which Caro was destroyed. He was destroyed with a piece of paper, and I am not going to answer it with another piece of paper. I have something better. He turned and held out his hand to her. There is one thing in this world that cannot be forged, said the Duke of Wexmoor, and it is a pair of hands that learned a piece of music before the music existed. Elo and Caro went up onto the platform. Her heart was going so hard that she thought the room must surely hear it. The harp was there, her father's harp, brought that afternoon by a man who had never told her he had arranged it, and she sat down and put her hands on the strings and looked out over 400 people who had shut their doors on her. Then she played the little nameless thing that her father made for her when she was 9 years old. It took a minute and a half. It was a small, plain, unimportant scrap of music, the sort of thing 100 fathers have written for 100 children, going nowhere, finishing nothing, sweet and slight and quite unbearably simple. And out in the room, one by one, the faces began to change, because they had heard it. They had heard it not 10 minutes before, grown to its full height, in the greatest slow movement written in England in 100 years. It was in there. It had been in there all along, and now that a plain young woman at a harp had shown them the seed of the thing, they could not unhear it, and they sat in that assembly room in a silence that got deeper and deeper and worse. She finished. Nobody applauded, nobody appeared to breathe, and in the second row an old man stood up. Ephraim Salas had come in a borrowed coat. He had been a violinist for 40 years before a cart took his hand from him, and he stood among the people who had never in their lives looked at him and spoke straight out into the room, in the enormous voice of a man who has spent his working life making himself heard over an orchestra. I heard Ambrose Caro play that, he said, in his own front room, to his own little girl, and she cannot have been above 9 years old, and I never forgot it. I have known for 12 years that there was something wrong with that adagio. I did not know what. He sat down. An old woman at the back stood and said that she had been the copyist's wife. A man near the door said quietly that he had played second horn on the night in question, and that he had said at the time that the score they were playing from was the old man's, and had been advised to hold his tongue if he wished to go on eating. And in the middle of that long, bright room, entirely alone, with the floor widening around her exactly as it had widened all evening around a girl in a mended gown, Lady Adeline Stern stood with the pleasant smile gone from her face at last. She did not speak. There was nothing left anywhere to say. She had built her whole life upon a dead man's name and a buried thing, and the thing had come up out of the ground in front of every person in the county who mattered, and there was no gracious sigh that could cover it now, and no cold shoulder that could turn it away. She went out very upright, which was all that she had left to be, and the crowd parted to let her through. The invitation stopped inside a month. It was done to her precisely as she had done it, and with the same excellent manners. And Aloan could find no triumph in it anywhere. There was nothing in it but the plain, slow arithmetic of a debt that had been outstanding for 12 years and was finally being paid. They cleared her father's name that autumn, in the proper forms with lawyers and papers and time, in a quiet room and not a loud one, because the loud part was over. At the end of it, there was a document which stated, in the dry language of such documents, that the symphony known as the Vesper was Ambrose Caro's and had always been his, and that his name was restored to him and to his heirs. She held it in the music room at Ilvern, at the grey hour, with Wexmore beside her, and she wept the weeping that she had trained herself out of 11 years before. He did not go to the spinet. He put his arm around her and let her weep, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that wanted saying. He never knew, she said, when she could speak. He died believing that he had failed, and that his daughter was left with a poisoned name and not one person in the world. He never knew that anybody believed him but me, and I did not count for anything. He knew, said Wexmore. She looked up. I went to him. Before he died. It was the last thing I did before I stopped speaking, and I have never told a living soul. I went to that room in Southwark, an unknown young man with no proof of anything and nothing whatever to offer him, and I sat with him and I told him that I knew he was innocent, and that I believed him and that I would not rest until it was proven, however many years it took. He was very ill by then. His hands had gone. But there was a hired pianoforte in that room, and he got himself over to it, and he played me 3 bars of a little piece, very slowly and very badly, and he watched my face the whole time he was playing it, and he saw me understand. And then he said, "That is the whole of it. That is the one thing they cannot reach. It is not written on any paper, anywhere in the world. Stern has seen to the paper." He said, "My daughter has had it in her hands since she was 9 years old, and she does not know what it is. He said, do not put it on her until she is strong enough to carry it, or you will finish what he began. He said, wait for her." So I waited, said the Duke of Wexmore, 11 years. And I have been afraid, every single year of it, that I had waited too long. Your father knew, Eloan. He died knowing that one man in the world believed him, and knowing exactly how it would be proved in the end, and knowing who would prove it. He did not die thinking that nobody believed him. I saw to that much, at least. He asked her in the music room, in the autumn, at the grey hour where the whole of it had begun. He did not play it to her. He had done with playing things to her. He said it out loud, still rough, for the voice would carry the mark of those 11 years for the rest of his life, and she thought that she would not have had it any other way. The roughness was the proof of what the speaking cost him, and therefore of what she was worth. "I have given you back everything that was taken," he said. "Your name, your father's name. The royalties of that symphony, which are considerable, and which are yours, and which will be paid to you whether or not you ever speak to me again. I made certain of all of it before I let myself say a word of this, because I would not have you take me out of gratitude, or out of need, or because you had nowhere else on earth to be. You have somewhere else to be now. You have the whole world back. It is a poor thing, and it is yours. So I can ask you cleanly, which I could not have done in the spring." He paused, and she saw the cost of it. The man who had spent his words so carefully for 11 years, spending the most careful of them all. I took my own silence for peace. I have found out this year what it actually was. Stay. Not as my grandmother's musician. Not as a debt that I am paying. Not because you must stay, because you would. Marry me, Eloan. I have 11 years of things stopped up in me, and you are the only person I have ever wanted to say them to. And Eloan Caro, who had come to that house with nothing in the world but 2 cold hands, went to the little cupboard by the window and took out a marbled notebook and put it into his hands. "Every phrase you ever played me," she said. "All of them, from the 2 notes on the spinet to the last one. I wrote them down every night of that winter, and I would not let myself ask why. And I think I understood before I understood." She reached up and touched his hard face, which she had never done. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, and I will make you talk, though I warn you that I have grown very fond of the silences, and I intend to keep a good many of them." They were married at Ilvern in the spring, and Lady Hesper took the front pew with the air of a woman collecting on an investment, which, she maintained to the end of a considerable life, was precisely what she was doing. She could still hear that day. Only just. Eloin played for her. She played the little piece which was printed now, and played that season in every capital in Europe, and to which Eloin had at last given the name her father had never troubled to give it, because he had made it for one person and had never imagined it would need one. On the wall of the music room at Ilvern, framed among the shelves, there hung to the end of her life one plain sheet of paper, 4 lines in a spare upright hand about an engagement and a fee and a waltz. And at the foot of it, where a name should have been, 5 notes drawn on a scrap of a staff. She had held that paper in the rain outside a house that had just turned her away cold and hungry, and 3 weeks behind with the rent, and she had turned it over and over in her hands, and had not been able to read it. He had told her on the very first day, in the only language he still trusted. He had put it at the foot of the page where his name should have gone, and signed himself with her father's music, and sent it out into the rain to a woman who could not yet hear what she was being told. Every respectable house in London had refused her, one after another, and by the only measure they had, they were right to. And one man who never spoke asked her for a single simple waltz, and heard, in 4 broken seconds of it, the thing that 11 years of silence had been waiting for. She played for him every morning of the long good years that followed, at the gray hour in the growing light, and when the piece was finished, more often than not, neither of them said anything at all.